Namaste, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Bharat Varta podcast. I have a very special guest today. Monica Halan is consulting editor at Mint and author of the highly acclaimed book Let's Talk Money, which I read the past couple of days. And I must say, it was one of the most lucid, informative, and interesting reads that I've read in a long while. We're going to discuss personal finance, economy, and a bunch of related topics today. So without further ado, welcome to the podcast, Monica ji. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much. My pleasure.
Yeah, so I guess I want to begin with a little bit of context about your background, right? So you've been writing about personal finance for, I think, about 2 decades now. And in this time, how do you see the Indian consumers' attitudes change? How have you seen that change? And maybe you could talk about how you got into this as well.
First of all, thank you very much. It's a real privilege to be on the show. Yes, I've been part of this journey for about 2 decades. And how I sort of discovered personal finance was an accident. I am a business journalist, but about 97, the Outlook Group was launching this magazine called Intelligent Investor. And for a variety of non-professional reasons, I left Economic Times to join the startup magazine. And this was personal finance. It didn't exist in India, because business journalism was all from the business's point of view, from the CEO's point of view. But the minute I began to see the world from the individual, from the household's point of view, the whole world changes, the conversation changes. And it's literally any journalist who does personal finance can never go back to saying the CEO likes this or Sensex up, Sensex down, because there is so much more meat in the space that most journalists don't like to enter, which is personal finance. There's so much to do here. So that was really my introduction, and I've never left the space because I just feel that we can keep going deeper and deeper and wider in this space. And when you ask how have things changed drastically, 97 when the magazine launched, it was 91 was the economic freedom for India. Before that, if you remember, the government set interest rates. The government, a bureaucrat would actually decide IPO prices in the stock market. Insurance was, private sector was not allowed. 91 sort of opened the gates to a lot of private sector participation in the financial markets. And, a decade later, by the turn of the century, we found a whole new generation of people entering the market as first income earners, and entrepreneurs and firms also entering with their products. And we've seen how this transition has been of a mindset which was very risk averse, which was very afraid of the future because of the lack of opportunities, really. The younger Indian is far more risk taking. And I see a very nice, healthy attitude towards confidence in the future. And that really reflects in the kind of financial products that people use. So if you are a fixed deposit, life insurance, real estate, gold investor, it sort of shows your mindset about how you believe the future is going to be. But if you're trusting market-linked products, if you're going to products like mutual funds, which actually you can't see, hold, or sit in or smell, then there is a confidence about yourself, your ability to decode the products, and also about understanding risk-taking. So I've seen it's a shift. It's gradual, as it should be. People should not jump into market-linked products without understanding them. But the sheer number of systematic investment plans today, 8,000 crore, trillion rupees of household money is pouring into this market-linked product called mutual funds. So that itself, I think, is a huge, huge number.
Yeah. No, I can't help agree with you. Usually, things about whether it's business journalism or whatever tends to focus on economy and tends to focus on, businesses, companies, whatever. But the layperson relates to it from a personal finance perspective. And that is, I think, supremely important. And we've convincingly made the shift from FDs to equities, right? Considering that the number of investors who have come in over the last 4-5 months, record number of investors have come in. So your book is fantastic. It lays out the foundations as such of managing money. And one of the things that I really appreciate is the fact that you have systems over any preferred tips or tricks or stuff like that, right? So, I mean, if you could give us a snapshot of how, middle class can build wealth sustainably, irrespective of markets, that would be really helpful. I'd say, I mean, people should definitely go and buy a book and read it. But then if you could give us a snapshot.
Yes, sure, absolutely. I mean, this is what I do. This is my passion. So I discovered that people start almost at the wrong end of the spectrum when they start thinking of their money. And they start thinking that they need a lot of money they need to have money to invest, which itself is like a person saying that I need to have a thin body before I can exercise. Because you work out, you are in shape, not the other way around. So people who have very limited money think that they need more, but it's actually even $500 is a saving number. So one thing that people do is they don't think they can invest, and they wait for this one big moment when they have a lot of money and they'll rush to the market like Wall Street with a phone and something, and then, do these deals. So I think a mix of movies and too much day trading kind of television, and this whole stories about multi-baggers and stock tips and quadrupling your money. I mean, all of this is not investing. It's luck and it's lottery. There is nothing more to it. So we've got to understand investing rather than punting. And that's what I've tried to do in the book, to say, look, investing in my book comes in chapter 8. I don't even begin investing till chapter 8. I'm saying, unless you can onboard, unless you have a system which separates out your spending and saving, you are never going to know how much you can put away. So what my first step is like a baby step. It seemed almost stupid to people when I first spoke about it, but then it's such a simple hack. All that you're doing is you're separating out your spending from your saving, so that you never get up and say, oh, I don't know where my money goes. Because there is only X amount in your spending account. You have 3 bank accounts. You just keep taking away money that you're not going to spend, either as a residual or a target, and you move it to an account called invested account. So you're just separating out spending and saving. And then the first financial product I talk about is building an emergency fund, which is 6 months to 2 years of living expenses, depending upon your age and stage. So the other thing I realized is that people don't want to do long-term investing in markets, equity markets, because they think they may need the money suddenly. So if you start with that as a problem, and then the solution really is to have an emergency fund, either in a fixed deposit, or if you understand mutual funds, in liquid funds or funds that, ultra short-term debt funds. If you understand debt funds, then you do that. There is no shame in being in fixed deposits for your emergency fund. So if you create that pool, then you have also freed yourself from a tyrannical boss or workplace, because then you have 6 months to a year of living money. So you can take those choices, and your money is freed up for longer term investing. And add to that another safety net called medical insurance and a pure term life insurance cover for an untimely death of the principal earner of the family. Something happens to him or her, then the family gets a large chunk of money through a term insurance. So all that I'm saying is that you build these safety nets around yourself and your money. Now you're at a stage where when you can start investing. And even now, you do short, medium, long-term goals. You don't think about retirement as your first goal, because that's money tied up for the long term. So it's more of a system, and the system really has been left entirely open to interpretation by each person, because I believe every person will have very unique needs. So, I mean, I can tell you 50, 30, 20 in terms of what you spend, all of that is great. But these are rules of thumb. Each person needs to be able to modify this to work with their unique life situation. So as you said, no tips, no tricks. This is just a system, and the system you must work on, because money is that thing which is going to be there with you till the end. And even after you go, this is the money that you hand over to your kids or nieces, nephews, whoever. It sort of outlives you. So unless you have a system, unless you have a way that you think about your money, you're always going to be thinking about doing something with it. So
Right.
it's just putting in systems in place to give yourself control over your financial life. So I don't promise to make you rich overnight, but I do believe that you get more stability and control over your financial life.
Right. Yeah, so couple of things from what you mentioned that I want to pick up on. The first is, people have this attitude of, okay, I'm going to double my money or triple my money or things to that effect, right? But then what you actually advocate is letting it compound at a reasonable rate year on year. Uh, so why do you think people fall for that old trick again and again all the time, right? And what can they do to sort of see the real returns and be more reasonable about that?
These are the oldest buttons. I mean, nothing has changed for 10,000 years. Fear, greed, anxiety, guilt, all of these are the oldest emotions that we have as human beings. And a lot of smart people in the financial sector know how to press those buttons to say that, to play on your greed. Insurance typically will play upon your fears. And people who promise to double, triple your money will play upon this whole greed. And also this, in social situations, often people brag about how smart they are with their money, how they did this multi-bagger deal, how they bought that property, and how. And there's a whole lot of conversation around how smart some people are. And then you feel you're left behind. I didn't do anything smart. My money is only earning 5% in a fixed deposit. I'm not that smart. So I think a lot of this is messaging in social situations, plus
Yeah.
a smart financial industry and smart people who really want to defraud you of your money will then play upon these emotions and try and get you to uh, give that money to them so that they sort of promise you double, triple returns. The only help that the only solution is to imagine that if there was indeed this sure shot way of doubling your money, why is somebody wasting their time telling you? Why are they not borrowing from the bank at 12% and just, doubling their
Yeah.
money in a year? So what is it that is so special about you? What is this deal which is getting over in the next 5 hours? And unless I do this now, it's going to go away. So look out for these red flags, the pressure that somebody puts.
Yeah.
The deal is getting over. And it's only you because you know what, you're special. I like you very much. I'm going to give this deal to you. These are all red flags. If you should target something over the fixed deposit rate. So if fixed deposit is 5 and the equity market is giving you 10 to 12% average annual return, you're fine, right? So this whole thing of doubling is really this, this desire to, without doing anything, to get
Yeah.
wealthy quickly. So if you really want that fund, out of the 100 rupees you have to invest, take 5 rupees and gamble, do whatever it is that people do to gamble, do that, get that itch out of the system. But 95 rupees you invest. So 5 rupees you blow up on your
Right.
crypto or whatever, day trading. But 95 rupees, please invest, because investing is boring. There's nothing
Yeah.
exciting about investing. It's just, you just decide on what, your asset allocation, you decide on products, you don't bounce around. I don't even know most days what the Sensex value is. It does not matter. So
Hmm.
get your kicks elsewhere, not in the stock market.
Fantastic. The other thing that you mentioned is to actually calculate the rate of return, right? Because there's this classic, I know a friend of mine who's fallen for this. And in fact, one of the first things that I did after I read the chapter on insurance in your book was to message him and say that, hey, you know what? You've been suckered into this, right? Because there's this whole term versus ULIP or insurance as an investment kind of a thing, right? So where the term is a classic 10 to 15 grand a year, which technically goes to waste, versus hey, you pay 50 grand a year and you get part of it as a return. Yeah, so things like that, I guess. um, and you also advocate exposure to equities through mutual funds and other instruments. We've seen a lot of people get into the market over the last 3 or 4 months directly, right? Investing in equities directly. Would you have any advice to them? I mean, how should they go about, deploying their money?
So what the people who've gotten in the last 3-4 months and are directly day trading and doing derivative trading is that you've been very lucky, but don't believe this luck will last forever, because stock markets go up and down. And the day this market crashes, you're going to be caught with a very large exposure. So I would be very careful if I'm a newbie investor who's been sitting at home in the lockdown, has continued to get salary, has not had anything to spend on, no beer, no pub, nothing. Therefore, they're using the money to punt. All I'm saying is be very careful that you're not overextended, because the day the market corrects, you are going to be caught with a very large exposure. This is not investing. Investing is when we look at the number of systematic investment plans in mutual funds increasing. That is investing. When we see the fixed deposit numbers growing, that is investing. So day trading is not investing, it is fun.
Right. So the way we look at our jobs itself has changed, right? I mean, we're shifted into an era where we don't have that guarantee of a job for 10, 15, 20, or even 5 years, right? So you're starting to see a lot of people develop a side hustle or things to that effect, right? What would be a good hedge against some of these uncertainties, right? So in terms of developing a second or third income stream as such, any words of advice on that?
No, you're absolutely right that companies don't think twice before firing you when their revenues and profits are in trouble. So every employee should actually 10 years ago have started developing second and third career options. So I imagine that to be like on the slow fire. So there is when a typical Indian household will have a 4-cooker burner. So the front two have high flames and you're making the current meal on that. But the burners at the end, your slow cook burners, you should have 2 things cooking on the slow fire, so that by the time this job or this work gets over, something else is ready. And again, it really depends on the interest that you have. It's best to do something that you have a passion and interest for. It sounds hackneyed. It sounds as if, everyone says if you have a passion, it'll finally pay. But that actually is true. I mean, look at all the stories. What is it that people do to earn more? Will have it is your interest in that which gives you that extra edge, which allows you to give something of value to people. So in every job, so there is a job, but you obviously will have some interests. You will have some deeper knowledge about the area either that you work in or are deeply interested in. Your best side hustle ideas will come from that. And technology actually levels the playing field completely between a big business and you. It levels it. And you don't have to carry those admin costs and compliance costs. As an individual, you are far more nimble. I mean, look at all the ads when you scroll through Instagram, Facebook. I mean, look at all the ads that we are seeing these days for such innovative slices of markets, which you're almost compelled to go and try the services out. So there is, at no time in the world, is there a time that you can't make money. Anybody can make money. You just have to think about what is it that you like to do, what value can you add in somebody else's life, and can you get people to pay for that? And it doesn't come in 1 or 2 years. You'll have to cook it for a long time. And the more genuine interest and passion that you can put into it, the higher the chances are that it will actually pay out.
Right. So would you actually advocate that, a percentage, maybe a small portion of your assets or something go into something like this to develop a side hustle or a business or an income stream?
Yeah, absolutely. If it does need, usually these things don't need so much money.
Yeah, it's pretty organic.
Yes, it's, you spare 6 hours on a weekend and you start doing something. Some people start making videos to help people on board a software program or learn something in music. I know people who are teaching Sanskrit online and making a bomb. Okay, who would have thought like learning Sanskrit? But obviously, a lot of people are interested. So it's really
Yeah.
what you do, and it doesn't take that much money. And I've always believed money will never hold you back. Money will come. If you have a good idea, if you are doing something interesting, that money will actually find you. So if someone is saying that if I had more money, I would have done something, it's a defeatist statement that you're waiting to be served.
Right.
And those people will keep waiting. In the new world, those people will keep waiting. You've got to go and serve yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree with you. I think money can act as an accelerator, but I mean, you can do the 0 to 1 or maybe even the 1 to 10 journey pretty much organically bootstrapped.
Yes.
So the other fascinating aspect about your book, which I was saying before we got started, is the fact that it's so simple and lucid, easy to understand, right? But you operate in an industry that thrives on obfuscation. It makes really smart people seem very, very dumb with all of this jargon and all of this complicated, long winding sentences and all of those things. Do you think that's sort of changing or, I mean, how do we change that whole paradigm?
So yes, finance does make its money by trying to obfuscate, trying to use large words, which actually are very simple. And you're right, deliberately the book doesn't talk down to people, because I genuinely believe Indians are not stupid people. We are very smart people. So we are this, really value kitna deti hai kind of a consumer. How is it when it comes to finance, we completely become stupid? We are not stupid. We've been made to feel stupid. And this book has somewhere in that space to say, no, you are not stupid. If you understood all of this in English, you would be just as knowledgeable as the person who's spouting all of this jargon. Jargon is something you hide behind if you either want to hide or if you don't know enough. Because the more you know, the simpler you can actually put something down. So you're asking who will change this? I think it's really up to the regulators and the policymakers to have protocols in place which mandate that financial firms need to put down disclosures in a simple language. Right? So if you look at disclosures, so our market is designed, it's a neoclassical version of economics. It's designed as a buyer beware market, which means the buyer has to buy and it's his risk. How does the buyer know? Firms make disclosures. In what way do financial firms make disclosures? 2-inch thick documents of legalese. You need a degree in law, finance, astrology to be able to figure out what those guys have said. The regulator's job is to turn that document into a one-page sheet written in English, Hindi, whatever language, which clearly tells a person what to expect. If that document could just list out the risks. For example, in the 81 bonds sale to investors through the Yes Bank officers, at no point did anybody talk about the risk of the entire money being forfeit. It's in the contract. But RBI does not mandate banks to make the disclosure in a manner that people understand. So yes, the word extinguished was written, but who's going to understand what does extinguished mean? Why could there not have been a disclosure saying there is a risk to your interest and your entire principal? Who would have bought this had they read this? The 65-year-old person who had put his retirement money would not have bought it, as he should not have. So I'm always passing the ball back onto regulators. I don't blame the front line because they are responding to incentives as economic agents do. It is up to the regulators to put in place market rules which prevent such behavior.
Right. But you're also seeing a new class of startups emerge, right? I mean, who we call fintechs. And they're broadly doing two things in my opinion. One is they're simplifying the process in which, you can buy some access and buy some of these products. And the second, they're also introducing new products and new asset classes and so on, right? Like, let's say, for example, peer-to-peer lending and stuff like that. So how do you see that, playing out?
So, yes, the entire fintech space is a huge upgrade in terms of lowering costs, increasing reach. And a lot of them have really made investing really simple. And that really is the way forward of using technology and using entrepreneurs to break that old stranglehold of the large finance firms to reach consumers better. So, what happens when a whole upswing of entrepreneurship happens in an industry is that players will come in and they start stretching the boundaries of regulation, the way that it is beginning to happen in peer to peer lending. So, a lot of young kids are able to get small loans quickly on their mobile without understanding that this is costing them 36, 48, 56% interest, and they have actually given control of their pictures and their email dumps to the people who have given the loan. There's a lot of information that you have just signed away to strangers. So regulation is sure to come in. So I'm both excited about fintech and also a little afraid, or because this whole data dumps that we so freely give away can become a big problem if things go wrong and somebody is not able to pay back that loan.
Yeah, actually, the whole lending business or the neo lending business is a bit scary actually, because it's essentially a collecting business. But then, I mean, they show the loans dispersed as something to be proud of and raise at higher valuations, right? So it's a
Right.
sort of a cycle that, yeah, I mean, that happens. So, we earlier spoke about how either we have talk about the Sensex or, companies getting acquired, mergers, etc. Or you have things around inflation and monetary policy, which all of these things. What should the layperson know about monetary policy as such? So, for example, if I see that inflation has gone up, or some such thing, what should a layperson understand about these terms, and how does it affect their personal finance?
So the layperson needs to understand that it is the household which is actually at the center of the whole story. So people can talk of big things like deficits and policy rates and all that, but it is the household in our avatars as the consumer, the worker, and the investor. Right? So the same person is a worker, an entrepreneur, an investor, and a consumer as well. So it is in the way that we earn, we spend, we save, and invest that the whole story of the GDP gets created. So we have a very crucial role. It's just that we don't have a voice. So companies will have lobbies, and intermediaries will have associations. The consumer is this disparate lot. Even the employees as a chunk are not united. I mean, the unions are a small part, and that's a different story. But every decision of the government has a bearing on individuals. So so we need to understand that when the government runs a very large deficit. So what is a deficit? Deficit is the excess of the government expenditure over revenue. Government collects revenue by way of taxation, and that's a separate story. Indians don't pay enough tax. So there's always a gap between the revenue that the government collects and what it spends. Sometimes when governments spend too much, 2008, the whole loan waiver, a huge amount was spent which India's budget could not support. That triggers inflation. It also triggers government borrowing, because finally the gap between government revenue and government expenditure is made good by government borrowing. You need the money to be able to spend, so the government borrows. When the government borrows excessively, it crowds out all of the other investments. So private sector finds it difficult to find money because the government has soaked up all of the money. So large inflations caused by excessive borrowing will hurt the savers. Because what happens when you have very high levels of inflation is that your real return comes down. What is the real return? You're getting 12%, you're getting 10% on your bank deposit. But if inflation is 12, you're making a negative 2, right? So your real return is -2. So today, if my bank deposit is giving 6 and inflation is 4, I'm thinking my interest is very low, but it isn't. It's actually +2 because your inflation is at 4 and your interest is at 6. So we need to understand that uh, macro events have a very large bearing on micro, on all of us as individuals, because uh, when the government is not able to, gather enough money, it uses something called financial repression. So India has been a textbook case of financial repression, which is that household savings are appropriated by the government very cheaply for its own use. And it's a hallmark of a low developing country, of a poor country. For us to be able to get out of financial repression, which means then people are able to get better rates of return, better financial products, markets open up. So we are in this transition between financial repression and the Indian saver investor getting a better deal. But everything that happens at the macro level impacts us personally, whether it has to do with taxation, whether it has to do with the banks getting recapitalized. So the whole NPA problem is really all of our problem, because as taxpayers, we are paying for that entire recapitalization of the banks, which is really bad loans made either by error or deliberately to people who haven't paid back. So, it's all interconnected. Even if a person is not paying his or her taxes, you're going to pay for it in terms of, inflation, your returns being nominal returns being, your real return being lower. So finally we pay, whether we pay from here or we pay from there, the payment will be by the individual. So that once we start understanding the economics behind the politics, maybe our political decisions also change according to that need.
Right. Yeah. And you've seen that, and you mentioned as well, there's been an increasing awareness over the years, right? So this financial literacy as such, who would you put the onus on in terms of improving this financial literacy, right? So do you think the government should play an active part in this, or should it be like an institution like SEBI or RBI or someone else who should, step in and improve this financial literacy for us?
So financial literacy has been this bogey used by regulators to transfer their responsibility onto consumers. You've academic mega, when people track the efficacy of financial literacy, the way that it is done, you get people into a classroom and you make them understand what a mutual fund is, what this is, what that is. The efficacy is 0.01% and it dies over time. Right? So the kind of financial literacy that we have thought about doesn't work. And it is a regulatory cop-out, because regulators then say, oh, it is a literacy problem. It is exactly the opposite. Financial literacy has to be hard-coded into regulations, because at what point are you the most open to receiving education about a product? It is when you are buying it. When you need a home loan, that is the time that you are most open to understanding all aspects of that. It is when you're buying a mutual fund or an insurance product. And the person who's most able to influence you is the agent, is the person selling. So this has been a long-standing theory of mine, that if you can place incentives in financial products so that the person selling becomes the person who educates me, acts on my behalf, we practically won't need literacy classes or budgets on literacy. So it's a regulatory shift which says that why can't we place incentives in the right places so that the agents selling the products do the right thing. And then the literacy, the literacy rollout is really about telling people things about what questions to ask, what are the dangers, what are the options available, all of that. But in terms of educating a person on what a mutual fund is or what an insurance policy is, that's the job of a person selling. And he or she will do the right thing if the incentives are in the right place, so that as a consumer, I have a good outcome.
Right. So can you suggest maybe like 3 or 4 things that the government or policymaker should do immediately, like to align these incentives? One of those things that you
Right.
mentioned is, yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah, so it's again been a long-standing demand of mine that we need what is called a seller beware market in India. So I described what I mean by a buyer beware market. And remember that markets arise out of policy thought, and policy thought arises out of academic work in economics. So the neoclassical economic world was this free market world where entrepreneurs produce goods and people buy. There's an information asymmetry, so disclosures are to be made, but it's a buyer beware world. Now, there's a new branch of economics called behavioral economics, which says that our brains play tricks on us and we will consistently make the wrong decisions. Therefore, if we pull the behavioral econ thread long enough, we'll come to a market structure called seller beware, in which it is the seller's responsibility that he sells a suitable product. I'm not talking of a favorable outcome of the investment, of making money always, but he should sell a suitable product. So suitability is about not selling life insurance to an 85-year-old person. Suitability is not selling a sector, high-risk sector fund to an entry-level, first-time, low-risk investor in mutual funds. Suitability is not selling a second home loan to a person who already is overstretched on his first loan. That's suitability. So a seller beware market would put the onus on the advisors and sellers to sell suitable products. That is the change which would sort of transform the market from the current accidents that we have.
Right, right. So the other facet about India is that, we have one of the highest savings rates in the world, right? But as we become richer, more prosperous as a nation, you're going to see a lot of discretionary spending as well, right? I mean, in fact, some people advocate spending to spur demand and move the economy forward. What are some things that the government should do to sort of like, align this in the right direction?
So the government typically will try and incentivize savings by giving tax breaks. So that's what the government does. So the discretionary spending, you're right. I mean, we were moving towards, especially the millennials and Generation Z taking loans to finance current consumption. But I think COVID has been a good wake-up call for a lot of people who were spending excessively. So basic metrics, again, this is the part of financial literacy which should actually come in, that at what point have you taken too much loan? So 30% of my take home going as EMI, and that 30%, is it just depreciating goods? Is it appreciating goods? Is it just consumption? I would worry if 30% of my take home is going to finance current consumption. So it will be a mix of events as they happen, and this volatility is not going to go away. I mean, I don't think COVID is something which is just going to go away. I would expect many, many more events as we go along to keep hitting us. So this sort of has been a great wake-up call, but I would imagine that literacy efforts to tell people that a credit card spend which is not paid back costs you 24 to 36%. And the math is done to say what a 50,000 rollover really means in terms of what you pay. So those things possibly will help. But finally, it's really about how people foresee their future. If they feel very secure about the future, people will take more debt. And if they feel
Right.
afraid about the future, they will pay off their debt. So those are things which are more to do with individual assessment of what their life is like.
Right. So ahead of this episode, we had asked people if they had any questions for you, and there are a couple of questions that I want to take. One of the chapters that you cover way at the end in the book is retirement, and we have a related question. We have this question from Guru Prasad, who says, "Can NPS be structured better in order to make it more attractive? If yes, how?"
So NPS is a product which was designed for, one, it was the central government workers who the government wanted to move away from defined benefit. And it is for the unorganized sector workers, the consultants, the doctors, the lawyers, people who don't have the benefit of an employees provident fund, the EPF, because if you have EPF, you don't need the NPS. So for everybody else who's not on the EPF, the one problem with the NPS is the mandatory annuitization, which you, when you retire at 60, 40% of your money will by force go into an annuity in an insurance company. The annuity market in India is very poorly developed. There are very poorly structured products out there. So my own personal hesitation in using the NPS is I don't want to give up control of 40% of my money to an insurance company who may not offer me a great product. So if there could be some way of the pension companies themselves offering an annuity product, which is structured better, I think that would be the real game changer for the NPS.
Right. So we have an equity related question. Does an SIP into good quality stocks make more sense than an SIP into fund houses if one knows the basics of investing already? So this is from Nishant Iyengar.
Right.
I think you cover this in one of the
right.
chapters.
If you do know, I mean, if you are a stock picker, you know how to read balance sheets, you are able to track global events like oil price rising, gold price rising, dollar, Brexit, China, Korea, nuclear war. If you are really able to decode events and translate that into your knowledge about stocks, I mean, who would have known the bump that pharma stocks, for instance, would get? Who would have imagined what would happen to airline stocks and hotel stocks? So I always say that if you have that extra edge about knowledge about stocks, maybe in a sector that you operate in, sure, I mean, yes, absolutely, go ahead and buy directly. But if you think that, if you can create a portfolio and you have the time to do that, absolutely. But my understanding is most people are unable to do that. They largely focus on their winners and they will never talk about their portfolio return. Because if they did, it would be somewhere around Sensex return. So that 40% jump that they talk about normally is of the 2 stocks of the 10 that they hold. The rest of the 8 they don't have to talk about because it didn't do so well. So be honest with yourself. Look at your portfolio return. If your portfolio return consistently has beaten the benchmark by 10 percentage point, you obviously have a knack. So absolutely go right ahead.
Right. So what part of the stock market is driven by sentiment and what part of it by, some of these underlying principles, right? I mean, so one of the things that you talk about is the fact that, hey, the stock market isn't a gamble. But then when you see some of the things that happen, like, for example, let's say a pharma stock shooting up because somebody said they found a cure for COVID or they're close to a cure for COVID. How does one beware of these things reasonably, when investing in the stock market?
So stock market is a lottery short term and the index is a smooth ride long term. So stock market is very volatile. It's a very moody creature in the short term. It sulks, it throws parties, it does all kinds of things because it's reacting to short term news. But long term, it's like this balanced guy who's just sort of chilled out. The ups and downs get smoothened out. And when you take that pharma example, That's not an aberration. That is how the market is. It's the market is a way to price in all the information gets translated into this one thing called price. That's why markets, we call them efficient. Otherwise, how will you know the value of something? So a stock market has millions of participants. Each of them have a view on some part of this story. And these millions of pieces of information get collapsed into this one thing, which is the price. So if pharma stock prices have gone up because of a cure, it is because the market believes that this vaccine will sell and sell and sell, and this company will make a lot of money. But that is what business is about. Right. And if as an investor, you had that, your choice was, so there are 10 firms making vaccines, you could have bought maybe 2 of them, but through a pharma mutual fund, you could have bought all 10. So if the 2 that you had bought got the vaccine, you got a multi-bag. But if none of the 2 got, you have lost a lot of money. But in the 10 that you bought through the pharma fund, got an average Sensex plus return. So it's a matter of either knowing that this firm will get the vaccine, but if you do know, then we don't know how you know. Right? So because this is something that nobody knows, even the firm itself doesn't know. So you're lucky. So it's luck versus, do I want to try my luck, or do I want to have sure Sensex plus returns?
Right.
So that's the deal.
So one of the things that I want to talk to you was about Bitcoin, which seems to be the flavor of the season, right? Now, people usually buy gold as a hedge against currency and inflation. Why not buy Bitcoin as a hedge against currency itself? Because arguably Bitcoin is a better hedge than anything, right? I mean, because it's
one of the fundamental rules of investing. Fundamental rule of investing is that don't buy something that you don't understand.
You don't understand, yeah.
I can understand gold. I know it's a metal. I know it's a precious metal. I know there are 10 ways of buying it. I know the historical price of gold. I know that the dollar value and the gold value are mirror images. When dollar goes up, gold goes down. When so I have a lot of history of understanding gold. And there is a metal sitting over there. Even the Sensex has the fundamental company which makes soaps, colas, medicines, tractors. There is something being made over there which reflects into profits, which reflects into stock prices. In Bitcoin, I don't know what it is. So yes, people have made a lot of money. But no, I cannot recommend that as an investment. It's a punt, it's a lottery. So if you want, and to place your safety emergency money in a punt is a very scary proposition. So like I said, if you have 100 rupees to invest, take 5 rupees and buy Bitcoin as a punt. It's a lottery for you. I don't call it investment because I simply don't know what the underlying is.
Right. So considering that, you advocate investing in a lot of these market-based instruments, right? Whether it's equity, mutual fund, etc. How do you see the Indian economy itself going forward post-COVID? How do you see that panning out?
So what has happened in the last few years, and it is the Modi government period, is that we have seen structural reform across the board. So there is a narrative which sort of pushes back against this argument. But it is true. We've had the IBC, the bankruptcy law come in. We've seen teeth being given to the Benami Transactions Act. We have seen the PAN Aadhaar link. We are seeing tightening on income tax rules. We are seeing the whole anonymization of payer and tax officer. We are seeing a whole lot of reform in different parts of the economy happening. And the best time to repair the fishing nets is when there's a storm out at sea. So this is actually the best time for India to be doing all this reform, because once we come out of it, we should be ready with a better set of rules, a better underlying structure on which to build the next stage. So 91 reforms happened. After that, there hasn't been enough political will to make this next leap. And that is again to do with politics, because that is the way it was structured. It was all interwoven. The interests were all into each other, so that if you pulled one, the entire system came down. And that is what we are seeing right now. Right from private sector, high-profile bankers being in the dock to NPAs being chased across the globe, we are seeing that entire system of a small group of people who were sort of benefiting each other. And that was really a function of an economy caught in a low equilibrium. That is how a smaller economy behaves. But at $3 trillion, aspiring to be 5 and then 10 trillion, we cannot have those rules to work. So I believe that a country throws up a politician, not that a politician sort of throws down a country. So the fact that there is a particular leadership today is also a function of what this new 300-400 million people who have poured into the middle class in the last 20 years, their economic aspirations sort of are finding a political
representation.
Yes. So it's not a very popular view, because this whole Modi government issue is very badly polarized for a variety of reasons. And I don't want to go into that. But if you can just dispassionately look at what is happening, I think we are doing well. Very, very tough decisions are being taken on things which nobody dared to touch earlier. So I am very, very hopeful of what happens to India in the next 5 to 10 years. These are tough things to do.
Yeah. I mean, we've discussed these reforms, on our previous episodes as well, and a lot of these are fundamental and are bound to cause some short-term stress for sure. So finally, before we let you go, you've had people writing to you for close to 2 decades now, right? Maybe you could tell us a couple of anecdotes, a couple of your favorite stories of people writing to you.
Right. So a lot of people do write to me asking for their portfolio reviews. And that is something that I typically don't like to do, because, you need a financial planner for that. But there is actually just one story which was not somebody writing into me. But this was, and this is a story from about 10 years ago. A friend used to run an NGO in Uttarakhand. And he said that that is the time that ULIPs were doing the rounds. And he said that his NGO workers, the Karyakartas, there are about 100 of them in different villages. There were some 50 villages and 25 villages with, workers across. So I went to about 4 of those villages and I did workshops across in Hindi on safe investing, just talk to them about government products like PPF, NSC, saying that I did the numbers in the way that insurance companies would do, to say if you put 500 rupiah, then you get that much. PPF is a short, it's a government. So, so I spoke about all of that. And so they understood that Public Provident Fund was this great thing. It's government guaranteed, tax-free. So, so I did that. And then a couple of years later, I went back. We did more workshops. And then, a woman came up after that, and she was all like red on her face because she had to tell me the story. And she said, you told us about PPF. So she went to the local SBI branch, and the manager wasn't willing to do it because, at that time, they just didn't want to do the extra work. And I felt really stupid, that here I am generating demand when supply is not there. But that woman just opened a fixed deposit. She said, okay, jane do. Make PPF doesn't matter. And then, in 2 years, she got enough money, she saved enough to send her son to Haldwani hostel for his higher education. So she just came to tell me that you told me that 500 rupees and whatever I could get in a month would work. And I just wanted to tell you it did. So this is like one of my best stories ever. That, and there are 2 lessons for me in that. One is that we don't even understand the lives. So here I am, the city person, going and talking of PPF without having a clue that the local SBI branch doesn't even have staff, because everybody wants to have a posting in Nainital. Nobody wants to be in Sitla. And they are Mukteshwar. So you can talk about a lot of things, but finally it is that ability of that person to get the product that you're recommending there, whereas insurance agents are there chasing them for that fat commission that they will earn. So that was a major lesson, that two things that actually it works if people understand it works. Second is we have to get these products to the people, the safe products to the people.
Right. Right. So this was a fascinating conversation, Monica ji. Thank you so much for your time. Lots of interesting nuggets in here for all of us to be reflecting on in the days to come. So thank you all for joining. Until next time, please stay safe and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in. This podcast was brought to you by the team at Bharat Varta. If you liked this podcast, then don't forget to share, subscribe, and rate us on your favorite platforms. We're available on Anchor, Apple, Google, Spotify, Stitcher, Breaker, YouTube, and a host of other platforms. We started Bharat Varta to facilitate long-form discussions on politics, policy, and culture. We don't necessarily endorse anything that was said in this episode. If you do wish to offer us any feedback on the content or anything else, do reach out to us on social media or get in touch with us on our website, www.bharatvarta.in. The links are in the description below. Thanks again for tuning in. Until next time, stay safe, take care, and Jai Hind.